My friends and I cannot stop playing a board game. It ruined our lives. I can barely remember what life was like before we found the game that June night. We were 6 high school kids bored out of our minds, trying our best to fill the void. Most of us had part-time summer jobs, but we were hesitant to spend money on anything. We all hoped to save for college. After what felt like hours going back and forth on deciding what to do for the day, we took a walk around our suburban neighborhood. It was the end of a yard sale day, and most people were packing up and heading inside. A few people still remained outside eager to sell. We didn't really have the intention to buy anything, but I still combed through the last pieces of used crap people set out. I always think I'm going to find some kind of amazing treasure, but always end up questioning my purchases hours later. I found myself digging through a showbox full of old board games. I thought I might be able to find a new game for all of us to play. I also figured since it was the end of the day, I might get it for super cheap. At first, I only saw games that looked into bad of shape to even buy. That or it was a game I knew my friends wouldn't want to play. I've always been a board game fan, but not so much my friends. I had to beg them for months to play D&D with me, and they were only willing to play it for my birthday. I'm always trying to find new games that might interest them. I was ready to give up, but then I saw a game at the bottom that I'd never heard of. Tasks with Friends with the tagline, "The game you and your friends will never want to put down." The box looked colorful and pretty worn out, but not so bad that we couldn't play with it. It just looked well loved. I tried to open it up, but the sides were taped down. I mean, it makes sense. You don't want all the pieces to come flying out after all. I didn't see a price tag or sign for the price, so I found the owner and asked her, "Excuse me, how much are you charging for the game?" I said eagerly to the woman while admiring the bright-colored box that lacked any company branding or trademarking. "Oh, that old thing. I don't know. Do you have $1 on you?" The woman said as she put the yard sale leftovers into one big box. As she told me the price, I perked up and started to dig through my purse. She either got annoyed with me taking too long or just wanted to be nice and told me to just take it. She immediately started to back up her box again. "So, is the game any fun?" I said to her awkwardly. "I actually never played it. My friend Jen gave it to me a few years back because her kids got obsessed over it or something, so she just wanted to get rid of it. She thought my family would enjoy it, but we just never got around to playing it," she said with her back facing me. I kindly thanked her and called for my friends to come over to see what I got. As I called for them, I could see their curiosity over what I found. That excitement was quickly lost when they saw I had a board game in my hands. They rolled their eyes knowing that I would try and get them to play it with me. "Kate, you know we don't do the board game thing," Aaron said to me, annoyed. "Come on, guys. You've all been going on and on all day about how bored you are. At least try. This game looks really fun. I actually haven't played this one before, so we can all learn together," I said as I saw their faces start to grow curious again. James came up to me and gestured at the box in my hand. I gave it over to him, hoping that he would be convinced to play after looking at it. I knew if he was down to play, everyone else would be too. As he held the box, I could see the expression on his face change from doubt to excitement. "Damn, this game looks like fun. Let's go play," he said with a giddy tone I'd never heard him use. He started to jog in the direction of his house with me close behind, and the rest of our friends slowly walking behind me, looking confused as to why James was so excited to play a board game when he was normally the person most against them. We all made it back to James' house. We walked in and were greeted by his mom, confused as to what made her emotionless son so excited. As we stood in the entryway, not sure what to say, We heard him calling us from the basement. We ran down the steps to see the game fully set up on the floor and ready to play. He was sitting on a pillow reading the instructions with intense concentration. "James, are we actually playing this game?" Bree whined, "Yes, we are. I promise if you just sit down and start to play, you will have fun. I had a chance to learn the rules while you guys got here." James insisted as he shuffled a pile of cards one last time. After a few minutes of back and forth, everyone was sitting down and ready to play. James explained the rules of the game directly from the intrusion manual. Each player starts with their token at the start of the board. Players will take turns drawing a card from the top of the deck. Each card will have a task. If that task is completed, you may move the number of spaces that are specified on the card. Once you see the card, it will say "Secret" or "Public" at the top. If it's a secret card, do not read it out loud. This task must be completed without anyone noticing or questioning the action on the card. For example, hold someone's hand, sing a song, insult someone, etc. Just complete the task without anyone calling you out. If a player does something you believe to be a secret task, say out loud "Deceiver." If the player was caught, they will show their card and fail their task. Do not move any pieces. If the person who calls out "Deceiver" wrongly accuses the player, then they must move back one space. The accused player will keep that card and continue to try and complete the task. Once you have successfully completed a secret task, you may announce "Task complete" and move your token forward as many spaces as specified on your task card. If you pull a public card, you must read it out loud. These cards will include things like saying the alphabet backwards. Don't say or until your next turn. Singing a karaoke song, playing dead for 1 minute, etc. Some cards have time limits and specific instructions. Every card will clearly state the task. The player who gets their token to the end of the board wins. The game will start with the player who lied last drawing a card. Take turns drawing one card at a time with the person to your right going next. Have fun. James folded the paper instructions up and sat them by his side, asking if anyone had questions. No one said anything. It seemed like they all understood the game fine. Or maybe they just didn't care yet. "All right, let's get the game started," James proclaimed, but was met with blank stares. "Come on, guys. I just read the rules. You should know how the game starts. We have to start with who lied last." Everyone remained silent. No one wanted to say their last lie. This is so dumb. "I guess I'll go. I told my mom that Henry wasn't hanging out with us when I left the house." "There. I'll go first," Bree blurted out as she leaned forward to grab a card. As she looked at it, she rolled her eyes. This is so dumb. Why are we playing this game? Come on, Bree. It can't be that bad. Can you read it out loud? Henry said, sensing that the card was embarrassing. "Ugh, public card. Pretend to be a cow for 3 minutes." She threw the card down and looked at Henry, who was to her right, expecting her turn to just be over and not wanting to even try. The rest of the group started to laugh and encourage her, chanting her name and begging her to do it. After about a minute, she gave in and got down on her hands and knees. When she first started, she was annoyed, staring daggers at Henry. As her time ran down, I could see in her face her feelings towards the game change. When the timer went off, she didn't stop for a few seconds. She kept going because she was laughing so hard. That was so fun. Someone move my token up one space. "Henry, it's your turn now," Bree said with a giggle and a newfound excitement. Henry looked at her in disbelief. He was so used to her cold exterior, but liked that this game made it melt away. Henry picked up his card. He motioned, zipping his lips shut, and shook his head. Me, Bree, and James all squealed in excitement, with the rest of the group looking lost, not understanding what they missed that got us so excited. Since Henry had a secret card, it was AJ's turn. She was chuckling along, but clearly just doing it because she didn't want to look dumb for asking us what was so funny. She pulled her card and read it out loud. It's a public card," she said with a dry tone, trying to gauge the room and observe everyone else as they celebrated her public card. "It says I have to do jumping jacks until my next turn." As she stood up, everyone in the room cheered her on except for Aaron. As she got to her feet, she paused and looked over at Aaron. I can imagine he felt like the only sane person in the room and wasn't sure what was going on. After a second of hesitation, she started her jumping jacks. Aaron looked around at us, eyeing him down, desperately waiting for him to read his card. By the time he finally picked up his card, AJ had started to laugh while doing her jumping jacks. "Sorry, it's a secret card," Aaron said nervously as everyone wiggled with happiness. "Well, looks like it's my turn," I said as I leaned forward, but was cut off by Henry quickly standing to his feet and lunging towards AJ, tackling her to the ground, interrupting her jumping jacks and making a loud thump as they hit the ground. "Henry, what the hell are you doing? What's wrong with you?" Aaron yelled in a serious tone that turned into him trying not to laugh by the end of the sentence. "I'm calling a deceiver on that tackle, Henry," Bree stated with a laugh. Okay, you got me," Henry said while still laying on AJ from his tackle. They both smiled over the event, even though it clearly hurt when they hit the floor. But you have to admit, that one was tricky. I tried to start my turn again, but was interrupted by Aaron. "Ha! Task completed." I yelled at Henry and didn't get caught. "I get to move to spaces," he said as he smugly moved his token to spaces on the game board. We kept playing the game for hours. We finished the first game and everyone wanted to play again. And again. And again. I looked around at them in disbelief. It felt impossible that all my friends were enjoying a board game. It was a dream come true. After years of begging. Finally. Normally at hangouts like this by PM, Bree and Henry would wander off to make out in some closet. AJ goes home to sleep, and Aaron, James, and I are left to awkwardly try and find something to do with just the three of us. It got to be 2 o'clock a.m., and we were either exhausted or our parents calling us telling us to come home, or we would be in serious trouble. We all went back to our houses, but all had a hard time going to sleep. We stayed up until a.m. for some of us, just talking about the game over text. Strategies, when we could play again. Funny things that happened that night. We couldn't get enough. The games we played started out pretty simple. No tasks got too wild, and while we really loved to play, it wasn't like it was taking over our whole lives. Not yet, at least. Because we played the game at James' house the first time, we ended up just keeping it there. Even though the game was technically mine, we always hung out at his place, so it just made sense. It was around a.m. the next day when our group chat started to blow up with everyone asking when we could get together that day. Now, because it was summertime and we were all teenagers, we either had work in the mornings or most of us slept until noon. But not me. I was always up early waiting for my friends to get up, so I had something to do. Or trying to make some money as a dog walker. That being said, I was shocked when I saw that everyone was up, and everyone claimed to not have work. James didn't have a job at that point, so of course, he was free, but everyone else was too. That did not happen often. We all met up at James' place at around a.m. that same day. Everyone eager to play. We must have played 10 games that day. The games consisted of us doing accents, being banned from saying certain words, backflips, and so on. Nothing too weird. We realized after a few games that we never got a repeating card. Not one time. This was strange because there were probably 200 cards in the deck, but even with us playing a dozen games, every card was new. I knew I had a couple of dogs to walk that evening, but texted the owners to cancel. No way was I going to leave while all my friends were enjoying a board game this much. I knew AJ said something about her having a shift at PM, but when the time got close, she went to the other side of the room and called out of work. She didn't even mention it to us or talk about it. She just stood up, walked to the corner, talked to her manager, and came back. No one thought anything of it. After a few minutes, she loudly proclaimed, "Task completed," moving her token up 3 spaces. We looked around confused at what task she had, and the card said, "Call out sick to work." We were surprised by this card, to say the least. It was the first time a card had to do with something outside of the players. Everyone else in the group canceled any plans they had for the rest of the day, although AJ was the only person who completed a task for it. It was around PM, which made it a full 12 hours of the game. Bree pointed out that we forgot to eat any food all day. After thinking about it, I realized that I hardly drank any water and went to the bathroom like one time all day. Things started to get out of hand that night. AJ pulled a card that said to go into a closet with the player to her left and kiss them for 5 minutes. Of course, that player was Henry. Bree was not happy, but she knew how serious everyone was about the game. She told him she wasn't okay with it, but he insisted that it was just a game and it wouldn't mean anything. It was worth 4 points for both people who would go into the closet. AJ and Henry stood up and went to find a suitable space, all while Bree freaked out and said she would end things with Henry if he went through with it. It was never completely clear what Henry and Bree were. They don't like to use boyfriend and girlfriend, but everyone knew they were a thing. Aaron tried to call it off, saying this wouldn't be worth it and to just stop, but it was like they didn't even hesitate. Bree sat on the carpet and started to cry as the timer on her phone counted down an agonizing 5 minutes. I thought I would either hear kissing or nothing at all, but instead, I heard talking. It started as soft whispers, then crying and yelling. They stayed in for about 2 minutes, then came tumbling out. "That's it, Henry. I can't believe you would do that for a game." "We are over," Bree said with a red, wet face. Henry came and silently sat down with AJ. AJ was now beet red as well. Despite 3 of my friends just going through something I couldn't wrap my head around, they all looked at James calmly and nodded for him to pull his card. No one had moved any tokens forward, so it was clear they failed their task of kissing in the closet. James hesitantly leaned in for a card and read it to himself as we were bombarded by Bree, AJ, and Henry all saying, "Task completed," and then shot confused faces at each other. They all threw down their cards and moved their tokens forward. Bree's card said, "Break up with Henry." Henry's card said, "Make AJ cry," and AJ's card said, "Tell Henry you love him." All those cards were worth way more than this stupid kissing card. So the kissing task was ignored, and they all individually completed their tasks without ever communicating it with each other. They all saw opportunities to complete a task worth more points, and they took it. After this moment, it was like nothing even happened. The girls stopped crying and started laughing and saying how impressive the completion of the tasks were. "Wait, guys, something is wrong here. Do you not see it?" Aaron said with concern, trying to take a break from the game. "Oh, stop. You are just jealous you didn't get to move 6 spaces, Bree said with arrogance. "No, I'm not talking about that. Does no one find it weird that the cards are using our names now? Not only that, but the cards are somehow interacting with other cards to almost try and make bad things happen." James blurted. As he said that, it was like we all froze in our spots, all looking at each other, realizing how hungry and tired we were, looking around at the room, seeing how big of a mess we made. Bree grabbing Henry's hand with a look of sadness and coming to grips with how they hurt each other for a game. I looked down at my arm and was reminded of the crud things I had drawn on my arm with Sharpies in order to move one space in an earlier game. I saw Aaron's jeans that were now cut into shorts with some kid's scissors. I looked at James' legs and saw his one shaved leg lying crossed over the untouched hairy one. I looked at AJ and saw she had a huge purple bruise on her arm. At that moment, I remembered feeling like an addict trying to get off drugs. I knew this game was hurting us. I wanted to stop, but felt like I couldn't. I could see the same feeling in all my friends' eyes too. The urge to say, one more game, just one more time. Just to feel the high of this dumb game again. I think we need to take a break from this game, guys. It's getting kinda weird and out of hand, I murmured with the strength that I somehow mustered up. It was like telling an alcoholic you were taking away their beer. They all looked horrified at the idea of not playing the game for even a moment. Just then, James' mom came downstairs and was horrified at what she was looking at. 6 disheveled teenagers all sitting in a circle, looking like they had all just been through a war. Not only that, but her whole basement was a mess. James, what the hell happened to your leg? Are you all playing that dumb game again? I can't believe this. Everyone out of my house. James, you are grounded. His mom shouted with rage in her voice. We all ran out of his house, not saying a word to each other. Just trying to get home and get some food. As I sat in my kitchen with my long-sleeved sweatshirt covering my now inked-up arm, I tried to eat a sandwich I made myself. I was starving. I could feel and hear my stomach growling, but my need to play the game was so much stronger. So strong, I didn't even want to eat. I sat at my dining room table, staring at that sandwich for what felt like an eternity, telling myself that I needed to eat and I'd feel better if I did, but somehow the thought of the game was taking up all my energy. I was holding back the urge to text my friends. It took every ounce of self-control I had left. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I involuntarily grabbed my phone so fast it was in my hand before I could even think about it. It was James in our group chat. Hey guys, so do you think that was a long enough break? I think I can find where my mom put the game and bring it to that old treehouse back behind Mr. Baker's house. I couldn't hold back anymore. I had to play again. Before I knew it, I was sneaking out of my house trying to remember where the old treehouse was. As I ran through the neighborhood, my phone lit up with texts from my friends saying they were on their way. After running around for a while, I found the treehouse. I couldn't believe I had such a hard time finding it considering how much time a few of us used to spend in it during middle school. I could hear all their voices sounding annoyed as I was the last one to get there. I climbed up the old wooden ladder to find all my friends sitting in a perfect circle, barely able to see the board or each other. It was around this time something strange happened within the game. It wasn't about winning the game necessarily. It was about playing as many games as possible and completing as many tasks as we could. If anyone won a game or finished a task, everyone felt a high, not just the winner. Because of this, players stopped calling each other out for trying to complete secret tasks, so people stopped being so secretive to complete secret tasks. They still kept them a secret because it was a rule of the game, just no one called them out. This made us all more ruthless. I sat down on the hardwood in between Bree and James. Our next game began. AJ drew a card first, and it was a secret card. She didn't seem giddy. She looked flush and scared. In fact, it felt like the mood had shifted with everyone. We weren't laughing our butts off anymore. We were terrified to stop playing. It was something in our guts that made us have to play, like a virus growing in us, desperately trying to get out. Next, Aaron drew a card and read it out loud. "Hold your breath for 5 minutes," he whispered with confusion. "How am I supposed to do that?" he said, trying to not get worried. It's not that the card was all that bad. It's that he knew he would stop at nothing to make it happen. He told us to keep playing the game while he did it, and got a timer up on his phone. He took a few deep breaths, then held his nose shut and became extremely focused, not making eye contact with anyone. Next, it was James' turn. He had a secret card and didn't show much emotion towards it. Next, Bree nervously took a card, and yet again, it was a secret card. In fact, we all drew a secret card until it was Aaron's turn again. It had been about 45 seconds, and he was really focusing, and we didn't want to make him draw a card while trying to finish his task. As we sat and watched our friend become more and more red from holding his breath, we found ourselves in complete silence. Other than the wind weaving its way through the trees outside and the soft sound of crickets in the distance, we all just stared at each other, terrified of what was on those secret cards. I knew I had to use every little bit of self-control I had left in my body to not try and complete the task on my card. I was betting that's why everyone was being so quiet. They all had tasks that they didn't want to do, but felt the uncontrollable urge to do it. My card said that I needed to remove one of James' fingers by any means necessary. It was worth 10 points. I couldn't believe I wanted to complete it so badly, but I was frozen figuring out how to do it. As I stared at him, I noticed he was looking over at Bree. I figured that his card had something to do with her. It seemed like everyone was fixated on someone else. I glanced down at the timer Aaron had, and I was amazed to see he had been holding his breath for almost 2 minutes. Just as I was about to comment on it, chaos broke loose. Everyone jumping onto someone else, making it one big pile of people viciously grabbing each other. I didn't read their cards myself, but it was clear by their actions what their tasks were. Of course, as you know, I was going for James' fingers, but James was ripping at Bree's ear. Bree was pulling Henry's hair out. Henry was tearing at AJ's neck, and AJ was trying to open my mouth to get my tongue. For a solid 30 seconds, we were all attaching each other when Aaron passed out from holding his breath. This seemed to snap us out of our trance for a bit. We ran over to our friend and checked his pulse. After we realized he was still breathing, we got lost in the game again and all jumped on each other to keep brutalizing one another. Just as I got my teeth around James' pinky finger, we saw a bright flashlight coming through the cracks in the treehouse and froze. A police officer popped his head through the bottom entrance to the treehouse and looked at us in horror. He saw Aaron out cold in the corner alone with the rest of us in a pile of blood and ripped out hair. The officer grabbed us one by one and practically threw us to the ground, where another officer put us each in handcuffs. We had hours and hours of questioning that night, but we were all released by sunrise. No one was badly injured, just a lot of cuts, bruises, and a few patches of hair missing. Even Aaron was okay. Honestly, Aaron made it out in the best shape. We all got grounded for the rest of the summer. All the parents agreed that we needed to stop spending time together because they insisted on us having some beef between us all. None of us mentioned the board game was at the treehouse that night because we didn't want them to take it away from us. We knew we had to play it again. However, they caught on to it and banned us from ever playing it again. We spent the next 3 weeks of summer miserable. Each one of us tried to fill the hunger to play the game by playing other board games or attempting to remake it, but it wasn't the same. It was the night before school started, and I got a message from James through Skype. Our parents banned us from talking to each other, But it seemed my parents and James' parents forgot about Skype. He told me I had to come over right now. I managed to hop out my window and ran for James' house. I got to his house in what felt like record time and jumped down the fire escape to the basement. There I saw the rest of my friends all sitting by the fireplace weeping. As I got closer, I saw they were covered in ash. I saw tiny little bits of what was left of the game lying out on the ground. She burned it. My mom burned it, James said in between tears. Everyone was desperately trying to find any pieces that were left of our precious game. Some of them rubbed the ashes of the game on their faces and arms to try and feel something again. As I watched them, I saw something in the corner of my eye. I looked over to our normal hangout area and saw it. I saw the board game sitting out. Not just the box, but the whole game was out and ready to play. Are you sure that your mom burnt it, James? I said as my eyes got glazed over looking at the beautiful board game sitting out for us to enjoy. Yes, I'm sure. She did it right in front of me, so I'd stop looking for it. Just as James finished his sentence, he looked at me and then at my eyeline. He saw the game. The next week of our lives was a whirlwind. After James' mom burned the game and it reappeared, we all ran away with the game. We stole a car from AJ's mom after we got a task card for it and left town. We would play the game in the car, in random fast food restaurants, and sometimes in parks. It's all we did all day. We would fall asleep playing the game and only manage to eat maybe a bag of chips or something small during the day. We kept moving because we didn't want to be found. In that week, we all managed to lose our jobs and all missed the first week of our senior year of high school. All because we were addicted to a board game. I still remember the last game we ever played. It was a late Sunday night. We were actually in our town sitting in an old barn near the treehouse we sat in before. All because the board game told us to. Up to that point, we were hanging out far away from home. We didn't want to be so close. We knew we could be found easily by our families and the authorities if we were too close, but we had no choice. We were slaves to the game. At this point, we were in bad shape. With every new game started, we broke down a little bit more. We surrounded the board with tired eyes and growling stomachs, missing teeth and bruised bodies, concussed heads and broken toes. Please, we have to stop. I can't do it anymore. I want to go home, Bree said as we were about to start our next game. I can't imagine not playing this game. It's all I ever want to do. I think I might die if I couldn't play it. I know the game hurts us, but it would hurt so much more if we stopped playing it, Henry said with a gravelly voice. Guys, why are we talking? We have to play again, Aaron said while trying not to cough. I know we have to. I've never hated something and loved something so much in my whole life, Bree remarked. We started the game with shaky hands, moving slowly and holding our breath whenever someone looked at their card. AJ went first. She reached down and picked a card, cringing to herself after reading it in her head. Next was Bree. She rolled her eyes and she read off the words. Public card. Waterboard the player to your right for 5 minutes. Both players move 8 spaces, Bree timidly said as she glanced at James sitting next to her. I can't say we really knew how to waterboard someone, but we laid him on his back with his legs elevated and dripped water over him. We let him take a card for his turn before Bree started the waterboarding, so we didn't have to wait for 5 minutes for them to be done. His card was a secret card. We continued the game with the awful background sounds of gagging and choking. Next, it was Aaron's turn. He read his card and winced. He closed his eyes tight and opened them again, as if he was hoping he was in a dream. As he opened his eyes, he slowly looked at all of us. making eye contact with each one of us. Just then, James was done being waterboarded, and he and Bree came to join us. I was so glad they were done, not just because I was sick of the sounds, but because it meant they got to move 8 spaces. Aaron stood to his feet slowly. I prepared myself because I figured he was about to hurt us. In an instant, he ran out of the barn and into our stolen car. We all looked around confused as to where we went, but kept playing the game as he drove off. Next, it was my turn. Public card. Jump off the roof of the barn. 9 points, I said out loud nervously. Henry and AJ jumped up and started to walk outside, not even questioning if I would do it or not. They weren't wrong in the assumption. Before I could even think, I was on my feet trying to find a way up to the roof. I found my way to the top of the 10-foot-tall building. I took a deep breath and leaped off and was met with a hard thump as I hit the ground. I felt a gut-wrenching pain in my right ankle as I landed. I knew I broke it. I had no doubt in my mind. I was thrashing in pain, grabbing my ankle as my friends dragged me back into the barn. We knew we had to keep playing. Next, Henry took a card. He picked it from the pile with his eyes closed and brought it to his face while peeking just enough to see the words on the card, then closed his eyes again, trying to pretend he never read the words in the first place. Next, AJ took a card. Even though it was a secret card, I knew it was about me. She glanced down at my ankle right after her eyes left the card. Just as James was reaching for his card, we saw Aaron walk back into the barn. We all sat in shock as his silhouette became clear and vivid in the doorway. Blood trickled down his arms and hands, dripping on the dirt as we all stared at each other. His eyes were blank at first, but then turned to pain. We watched him as he walked from the doorway to the game board, blood dripping on the game, as he moved his token 30 spaces. Aaron, what have you done? 30 spaces? AJ muttered in fear. James, I'm so sorry I had to. Aaron whimpered as sat in the dirt with his secret task card crinkled in his bloodied fist. Tell me what you did right now. What the hell does your card say? Show us. James yelled as he stood to his feet. Just as James was about to jump onto Aaron, Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out some matches we used to start small campfires while we had been on the run. We all stood still waiting to see what he was about to do as he lit 3 matches and threw them into the nearby hay bales, igniting the hole inside of the barn. Without hesitation, AJ saw the opportunity and stomped on my ankle as hard as she could. If it wasn't broken before, it sure was now. I looked down at it to see it now bent sideways. She then stomped on my other ankle, not breaking it, but making it so I couldn't walk. She moved her token 12 spaces. Even though I was in agony from the pain, I still felt such an intense high from her moving so many spaces. Aaron dropped his card in the midst of everything happening. James fell to his feet to see the card and started to weep as he read it out loud. Secret card. Kill James' mom. Move 30 spaces, he said with anger bubbling up. I can't believe you would do that for a dumb game. How? How could you do this to me? I couldn't control myself. Come on, you know what I mean. I couldn't control myself. Don't do anything you will regret. Aaron said cautiously. Oh, I think it's a little too late for not doing things we regret, James said as he jumped onto Aaron, choking him with all his strength. It seemed at that moment he was able to break free from the control of the game. He wasn't feeling the high of someone else completing a task. He just felt hate. Red-hot hate. I was overwhelmed, to say the least. The barn was in flames. James was trying to kill Aaron, and to make matters worse, AJ out of nowhere jumped up and dug a pocket knife into Bree's stomach. Now Bree and AJ were in a fighting match too. Henry and I sat across from each other in disbelief at our surroundings. He looked at me with death in his eyes as he reached for a card. It wasn't even his turn, but I don't think he cared anymore. He knew the others would be occupied for a while. The fire was getting bad. I knew I had to get out of that barn as soon as I could. Because of the damage done to my ankles, I couldn't walk, so I dragged my body out of the barn, taking the game with me. I made it a few feet and looked back to see Henry not moving. He set his card down on the board before I started to drag it with me, and I read it as I continued to crawl. Secret card. Let the fire overtake you. Move your token to the finish line and win the game. I was able to get out of the barn with the board game in hand. I sat and watched as the flames overtook Henry. He didn't even flinch when he caught on fire. As I saw it happen, I moved his token to the end space so he could win the game. I felt an intense high overtake my body as the game was complete. Only a few moments after Henry caught fire, the whole barn came down, with all my friends in it. I looked at the burning barn and then back down at the game. I'm ashamed to say that my biggest worry was not knowing who I'd play with now. I hate myself for thinking that, but that's how all the game is. I tried to start a new game by myself and drew a card, but that's when I saw the sirens of police cars and fire trucks pull up next to me. I was immediately surrounded by people trying to give me medical attention, taking me away from my game. I scratched and threw my body around like a toddler, not getting their way. I remember them giving me some kind of sedative and waking up in the hospital. I was the only person to make it out alive that night. All I could say to the doctors and my parents was that I needed the game, that I had to play the game. It was the only meaning to life. It was the only reason I had to live. My parents got me a great lawyer, and I got out of everything by pleading insanity. Our families all knew the right people and had the right money to ensure the word never got out about the deaths. They even managed to make the death of James' mom disappear. When they told me my friends were all dead, I didn't have much of a reaction. I just kept asking where the game was. When they eventually told me the game was gone and never coming back, that's when I lost it. They had to put me into restraints because I kept hurting the hospital staff from my meltdowns. I started to threaten the staff and told them all the horrible things that would happen to them if they didn't get that game back to me. I eventually ended up in a psychiatric hospital. I yelled and screamed so much that I never had my voice. I hardly ever slept because all I thought about was the game and how I craved to play it again. My skin was red and torn up from my insistent picking due to the withdrawals. After months, I felt numb. Maybe from all the drugs they pumped me up with, or perhaps I was so used to the withdrawals I didn't feel it as much. It still felt like I had an uncontrollable urge inside my bones, but I was able to hide it. They then sent me home after a while. I knew I had to mask my emotions for the game, pretend I didn't care anymore, even if it killed me inside to say it out loud. I walked into my bedroom and I felt like I was being treated like a baby. My old bed frame was gone, and it was just the mattress on the floor. All my sharp shelves were taken down, along with anything else I could possibly hurt myself with. I rolled my eyes but knew my parents had to make these changes for me to even come home. I sat on my bed and I looked around at my room, now with a doorknob that locked from the outside to keep me in, as well as bars on my windows. I searched my room desperately to find something to take up my mind. That's when I dug through my closet and I saw it. I saw that beautiful, colorful box that I came to know so well, just hiding in the back of my closet, waiting to be found. I knew it came back the first time it was destroyed, but it was feeling like it was a one-time thing. But here it was, patiently waiting for me to come and play it. I ripped open the box, giving myself a paper cut in the process, and started to play the game by myself. With all that being said, I can finally say, task completed, and share what my first card said in that solo game. Secret card. Spread the word about this game online so more people can join us. Move 20 spaces. So, what do ya say? Care to come join me for a game? Story 2. I fell in love with a doll. Sometimes, I feel like I was destined to be the bad kid. My dad walked out on my mom, and I before I could walk. And I remember being angry and confused about it since the moment I could form a thought. To make things worse, my parents decided to name me Dietrich, which is maybe the most skinhead-sounding name you can have. Pair that with some hand-me-down Cochranes and a jean jacket, and you've got yourself a certified red flag. All of this is to say that I was a serious piece of shit kid. I started stealing my mom's cigarettes at 11. I had my first fight at 12. And I probably would have been arrested at 13 if I didn't pin that break-in on my buddy Julian. Mom put up with me the best she could, until I hiked a Dos Equis bottle through the passenger side window of my principal's Chevy and got my second expulsion. It was at this moment that Mom decided serious measures had to be taken before her stupid teen son wound up with an adult-sized rap sheet. Her solution? Moving from our little apartment in Cheektowaga all the way to a decrepit crypt just outside of Baltimore. The house had 3 bedrooms, creaking wooden floors, and was way out of Mom's price range, but thankfully that didn't matter because she had just inherited the place. The house belonged to my grandmother, who I must have met maybe once or twice as a little kid. I have a very distinct memory of telling her she was a shit word because she wouldn't put peanut butter on my bananas. Whatever the reason that drove Grandma away from our little family, it wasn't enough to take us out of the will, even though the house and its inhabitants of dumb pretties, as she called them, was the only thing on it. Mom thought that taking me from one small town to another would be a fresh start. Truth be told, I didn't really care. I didn't have any real friends left back home, and I was already bored of my latest girlfriend, who was some dumb freshman I had no business seeing in the first place. I was 16 and already decided the world was shit, so I didn't give a rat's ass which part of it I ended up in. I spent my first afternoon in the house scuffing up the floors, kicking holes in walls, and carving my name into wood that was older than me. Pointless destruction is only entertaining for so long, so after a while I found myself exploring the grounds. I kicked around the weeds in the backyard. I found which of the bathrooms had an actual working toilet. I narrowly stepped on an exposed nail at the top of the staircase. Then I found the 3rd bedroom, the one neither my mother nor I would be sleeping in. This room was full of all of Grandma's dumb pretties, her name for the eclectic collection of shit she gathered in her 80-something years of life. To a respectless teen, there could not be a room full of any uglier, useless doodads in the world, and yet I found myself morbidly curious about each and every one of them. There was a clay figurine of a miner who gave me a good laugh when I twisted his head off and realized his neck was a cork. There were a lot of clocks, none of which ran anymore, a folded flag, and a bunch of little porcelain babies, but above all else there were dolls. Little ugly, sackcloth dolls with dead painted expressions. It was all weird, but nothing really surprised me. That is until I got to the back of the room. I almost hadn't noticed it, but tucked away in a back corner, sitting under a dust-filled beam of light, was a white sheet, draped over what I assumed was a chair. When you make a habit of stealing stuff, you start to look at things a little bit differently than most people. My first thought here was what could be so valuable that it was the only thing in the room worth protecting from all the dust. I didn't even care what it was, but knowing it was worth something to someone once was enough to pique my curiosity, and without hesitation, I pulled the sheet off. It was another doll. This doll, however, was different from all the rest. It was a woman and would be as tall as one if it stood up, probably standing at least 5'4", or maybe taller. Her body was built more like a puppet than a doll, with ball joints at the wrists and elbows and shoulders, anywhere a person's arms or legs would bend. The doll's silhouette was almost perfect, if not for her arms and legs feeling a bit too long and lanky, and the paint that would be her skin was starting to chip and peel to reveal the wood beneath. That is, everywhere except for her face. My God, her face. I still have trouble describing it now. It was perfect. Made of porcelain or something like that, much finer than the wood. If you weren't looking close enough, you'd swear it was the face of a real girl. A young black woman, to be precise, probably my age or a bit older, with long curly, real hair falling over her face. That face was flawless, not like the rest of its body, with not even a chip in the paint to break the illusion. I remember reaching my hand out to touch it, but stopping, completely wigged out by the thing. She didn't even have minor imperfections you might find on an actual person's face. She looked like one of those Renaissance statues, unbelievably lifelike to the point of being better than reality. Her cheekbones were perfectly carved or molded onto whatever material the face was made of. Her nose had little nostrils, and her lips even parted ever so slightly into what was almost a smirk. The only thing that broke the illusion were her striking, golden glass eyes, which stared perfectly forward, lacking in that look of life real people had. My trance was interrupted by the sound of my mom entering the room behind me. "Dietrich, I swear to God if you keep kicking holes in my walls." She saw what I had found and her face instantly broke into a pout. Her eyes were immediately trained on the doll, and I quickly moved my hand away from it. "What is this thing?" I asked. I didn't have to specify what. "Her name is Calliope," Mom responded. She had a scolding kind of tone, probably hoping I would show more respect to my late grandmother's things. "Your grandmother bought her at a carnival in France when she was about your age. She said she was made by some famous doll maker, and that she had always wanted one of his dolls ever since she was a little girl." "Neat," I said, a bit disinterested now that I had more context. "Yeah, your father always liked her too." It was my turn to pout now. Mom had broken the no dad talk rule, and then had simply walked out of the room with nothing more than a dinner's at 8. I looked back at the doll. I was now convinced she was nothing more than just that, some fancy doll bought from a creepy doll maker in France, the homeland of creepy weirdos. My frown deepened a bit as I realized exactly what I was thinking. Did I actually believe she was more than that? It was almost a month later before I thought about Calliope again. I had spent the night drinking with a couple of guys and this girl Veronica from my class. It was a pretty uneventful night, but I still remember stealing a couple of 6-packs from this guy Kevin's dad, and that I thought I had a chance of getting with Veronica if the cops hadn't shown up. The rest of it is more or less of a blur, up until I hopped the fence into my own backyard. It was late by that point, probably way past midnight. I had cut through a few neighbors' backyards to be sure that I had lost the cops, but I also didn't want to go through the front door in case Mom was there waiting to lecture me. I fell on my ass coming over the fence, and as I kicked through the weeds and tall grass, I realized I hadn't really been back here yet. It wasn't too hard to find my way around, though, thanks to a big, bright full moon in the sky. As I stumbled towards the house, I remember my leg getting caught in some tall weed, which was strong enough to wrap around my ankle and stop me for a second. As I knelt down to tug myself free, I noticed a weird white patch in the middle of the yard, reflecting the moonlight. I ran my fingers over it and realized it was concrete. A rectangle foundation, about 4 feet long, with an uneven surface. I figured there must have been a shed there at some point, got my leg free and went inside. I climbed through the kitchen window and up the staircase towards my bedroom. I thought all of my stealthiness was for nothing when I kicked something in the hallway just outside of my mom's room. She didn't seem to wake up, and I cursed under my breath and carefully made my way past several obstacles in the pitch-black hallway I remember being empty when I left for school that morning. When I got to my room, I went straight to bed, not even taking my shoes off. It wasn't long before I started getting this weird feeling, like I was being watched by someone else in the room. I glanced around, and even though it was dark, I was pretty sure nobody was there. I would have seen them, right? Some silhouette of a person, or I would have heard them breathing, or moving, or something. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling and found myself glancing at a corner of the room just by my dresser. Even when I fell asleep, I would wake up several more times in the night and look back over at that same spot, sure that someone was there watching me. The next morning, I knew why when I saw Calliope slumped over in a chair in that very same corner of my room. I marched through the hallway, now tightly packed with boxes of Grandma's doodads, straight to Mom, and asked her why that creepy fucking doll was in my room. She rolled her eyes. I need space in that bedroom for my home office, and it sure as hell isn't going in my room or out in the living room to creep out guests. I didn't listen and dragged the doll out into the hallway before going right back to sleep. When I woke up later, she was back in my room, so I dragged her back out again. This cycle repeated for a few days until eventually I just had to live with the fact that I was always going to wake up to that doll staring at me. I sat there one morning, just staring into her cold, motionless eyes. They were so shiny and perfect, even after all this time, that I could see my own reflection in them. Grandma's weird-ass doll was becoming more than a creepy, unwanted presence in my life. She was becoming an intrusive mockery of my defiance. That night, I decided to get rid of her. I grabbed the doll's arm and dragged her out into the living room. I wasn't just getting rid of the problem. Now I was making a point to Mom, showing her why I wasn't to be fucked with. I laid the doll's head against the bricks of the fireplace and stomped my boot down on her jaw. Instantly, I felt strange watching that perfect, lifelike face shatter like glass. My dramatic execution felt, for a moment, like it had a real victim, but then seeing the portions of her human face split into uneven pieces was like an uncanny reminder of just how good this inanimate thing was at mimicking life. I know now that in that moment, her little glass eye was staring back up at me. I left the shattered doll and went to sleep. When I woke up, she was back in her chair, as intact as the day I found her. I was quiet at breakfast that morning. I remember I couldn't touch my food and couldn't bring myself to make eye contact with my mother. I didn't say a word when she said, "I'm glad you stopped being stubborn about that doll." I would have thought a boy your age would be thrilled to have a girl in his room. She laughed. I didn't tell her about Calliope. I never believed in the supernatural, but I immediately knew something was wrong with that doll. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared shitless, and I was afraid of what might happen if I went to my mom about the doll, not that she would even believe me. I made it a rule not to bother Calliope. I wouldn't even touch the doll again, which also made my room a place of never-ending tension. I hated when I had to go in there and started to sleep on the couch in the living room or at a friend's house. When eventually I had no choice but to sleep in my own bed again, I would spend hours every night laying awake, staring at the doll, knowing that the moment I looked away, she would get her revenge. Time went on, and the revenge never came. Slowly, I stopped being afraid of Calliope, but I still stared at her. It became less of a defense mechanism and more admiration. I admired the doll for her beauty, how still and perfect her face was, how striking her yellow eyes were behind the sheen of glass. Before long, Calliope was becoming all I could think about. I'd drift off during class, thinking about her eyes. I'd call girls by her name by complete accident. I even became less of a troublemaker, because all I wanted to do at the end of the day was come home and stare at the doll. It wasn't long before I was talking to her, telling her about my day, and even sitting her next to me on the bed as I did so. My head was always clearer around Calliope. She never spoke back, but I could swear she understood everything I was saying, like she understood me in a way no friend or girl ever had. She didn't need to say anything to prove it. At the same time, I was starting to have nightmares. I dreamt about nails in the floorboards. I dreamt visions of my staircase, growing longer and steeper and darker as I stared at it. I dreamt about a malevolent, faceless being pressing its ear up against my door, a shadow in the backyard beneath the moonlight, and a woman standing at the top of a staircase, staring down at me. The dreams were always obscure, with an ominous feeling about the unclear images I saw in them. This didn't stop me from waking up in a panic, sweat on my forehead, and clutching my chest, like I might have a heart attack right then and there. Then I'd look over at Calliope, and everything would be okay. The panic would stop, I'd catch my breath, and I'd be able to fall back asleep, knowing that she was watching me sleep. It didn't get by me that my closeness to Calliope was making Mom uncomfortable. Occasionally, she would hear me talking through the door and come in expecting to see a friend or a girl, and instead see Calliope laying limp as ever in her chair. She always looked at the doll with fear, kind of like I looked at her before Calliope and I had started to get along. The look would only get worse when she glanced back at me, the kind of look I'm sure plenty of people get from their families before being locked up in an asylum or something. It's probably for this reason that Mom sent me to live with my great-uncle, just under a year after we had moved into the new house. She gave plenty of reasons. Great-uncle Abel was coming down with Alzheimer's and needed someone to take care of him. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd, which was why we left New York State in the first place. She even let her true colors show a bit the night before I left, snapping, "You're too damn old to be talking to dolls," before hiding her head in her hands and quietly sobbing at the dinner table. I didn't fight it. I had no reason to stay, though I kept thinking to myself what a shame it would be to leave Calliope behind. I spent a few years with Uncle Abel, and for the most part, they were uneventful. Abel's Alzheimer's was more or less easy to deal with, at least for a while, and by this point, I had more or less calmed down. Calliope did that to me, and even though she wasn't here, I could remember her calming presence whenever I found myself getting angry. I found myself missing her, the way someone might miss an old friend with whom they left things unsaid. It was weird, I knew it, but I knew that Calliope was more than just a doll, so it didn't bother me. In the autumn, I'd look up at the golden moon and smile. It reminded me so much of her eyes. At some point, Uncle Abel asked me if I had any girls in my life. Without thinking, I blurted out Calliope's name. "Calliope," Abel repeated, and I was immediately embarrassed. I shook my head and was going to explain it away when he said something that caught me by surprise. I thought she wasn't around anymore. Eventually, Uncle Abel's Alzheimer's became too much for me to handle on my own, and we had to move him into a home. I was 18, didn't have a job, and had no real choice but to move back in with my mom. Mom and I hadn't kept up much since I left, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw when I came back home. The house was dirty and uncared for, even more than when we had first moved in. Mom had developed a drinking problem while I was gone, the evidence of which was littered all around the house. It was a conscious sort of mess, with empty bottles stacked neatly in corners or on countertops, cared for just enough not to leave them lying about but not enough to throw them in the garbage. Despite this, or maybe because of it, Mom seemed really happy to have me back. She hugged me tight at the door and welcomed me home. She asked if I wanted anything to eat, despite the fact that the kitchen was clearly in no shape to cook anything in. "No thanks," I said. "I just want to go to bed." I was half lying, and she could tell. She told me the hallway was kind of a mess. If I didn't want to deal with cleaning it up, I could just sleep on the couch or on her bed, even, and she'd sleep in the living room. I told her to stop being ridiculous and broke away from her hug, despite her clear reluctance to let go. I climbed up the stairs, very nearly stepping on an exposed nail at the top step, and turned down the hall to my room. It was packed with boxes, clothes, rolled up carpet, and even furniture. It looked less like the lazy storage solution Mom would have me believe it to be, and more like a barricade. I picked through the stuff easily and approached the door to my old bedroom, only to find myself frozen in place. My hand on the doorknob trembled. I found myself wondering, what if she wasn't in there? What if she was? Which would be worse? I felt riddled with anxiety, thinking of all the things I would have to say and how I would say them. I was worried that Calliope wouldn't understand, wouldn't forgive me. I felt like she would ask where I was all those years, and I wouldn't know how to answer. I swallowed my nerve and opened the door, and there she was, sitting in the corner like she always had, motionless, without a sound, perfect in her stillness. I sat on the bed across from her and held her hand. It was the same painted wood it always had been, but to me it felt warm, familiar. Calliope was still here, and I was back, and there was nothing that needed to be explained. We were back together, and that was all that mattered. The nightmares started again that night. Nails in the floor. Something dark, something terrible trying to get into my room. A girl in the backyard staring up at my window, illuminated by the amber moonlight. The next year or so was rough. Mom and I would break into constant arguments, with almost anything triggering a shouting match. I was tracking mud in the house. I was staying up too late. I was apparently stealing her booze right out from under her nose. Anything would start the argument, but I felt deep down it was always related to the same thing. Calliope. She seemed to hate her, and it drove her crazy how close we were. It became clear to me that the 2 years Mom had spent alone in the house with the doll had taken their toll. She wasn't the same person I grew up with. She was always angry or paranoid, and I would often come home to see her sobbing at the kitchen table. She lost her job, was behind on the mortgage, and almost never allowed herself upstairs. I often wondered what sweet Calliope could be doing to make her so upset. I started to question if the scratches in the furniture and the broken objects littered around the house were my mom's doing after all. I remember needing to get out one night. I ended up going to a party, invited by the friends I made when I was still in school. It was a pretty mediocre get-together, but exactly the break from Mom's manic crazy that I needed. Veronica was there, and to my surprise, still into me. I chatted her up, and when she flirted with me, I flirted back, but the whole time my mind was on Calliope. After a haze of drinks, I was back in my bedroom, and I was so sure I brought Veronica there. I was staring at my feet at the edge of the bed, and was going to turn around and tell her that I just couldn't get it up, when to my surprise, I was met with the sight of amber eyes. It was Calliope laid out on my bed. I knew I hadn't put her there, but here she was. And there Veronica wasn't. I climbed over to her. I reached out to touch her hand and gasped. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like skin, the most perfect, soft, womanly skin I had ever felt. As I looked up her arm, I could see that it was free of the blemishes and chipped paint from before. It was as if a real woman was in my bed, only motionless, and yet I still felt her inviting me forward, asking me to continue without a voice. I looked into Calliope's eyes and she looked back. I cupped her cheek and kissed her, and her lips were the most perfect lips I have ever felt. I knew in that moment what I had felt for so long. I was in love with Calliope, and I didn't care how strange it felt. I knew she loved me back. "I love you," I spoke, more of a moan than a whisper. I felt darkness looming at my door, and at the sound of my words it flew open. Mom stood there in the doorframe, tears staining her face, a bottle in her hand. She screamed at me, asking what I was doing, both of us knowing it was a rhetorical question. I pulled myself off of Calliope and sat up straight at the foot of the bed, embarrassed, but still not letting go of her hand. Mom screamed and sobbed. "Look at you," she shrieked. "In bed with that fucking whore." I was confused, but I was also angry. I stood up and told her to take it back. I shouted at her, shouted that Calliope was not a whore, that she had no right to speak to her like that. In response, Mom pushed past me and chucked the bottle at Calliope's head. I was seeing red now, and I shoved her out of the room and into the hallway. She stumbled a bit, and I was brought back to the reality of the situation a little when I saw her almost tip over. I never once thought I could lay hands on my mother like that. It had never once crossed my mind, never felt possible. And here I had almost pushed her over. I cursed under my breath and slammed the door. I tried to walk right out the front door, down the street, anywhere I could get away from my mother and get my head straight, but she caught me on the stairwell. "Please, don't go," she stammered, tears running down her face and choking her words. "Don't leave me alone here with her. Not now, not." After that, I tried to shoo her off of me, but she latched onto me like her life depended on it. I tried to tell her to calm down, that nothing was going to happen. I said I needed to go, but she just kept shaking her head, sobbing, screaming that she was going to kill her. I shouted at her that it was just one of Grandma's dolls, and nothing else, something I didn't even believe. How could a doll ever hurt her? I asked. "Because my mother never bought that doll," she shrieked. I was confused and tried to take a step back, but she was latched onto me. She fell quiet for a minute, choking on her own tears, before continuing, trying to be more clear before her panicked, frantic sobbing. "Calliope was your grandmother's maid. That little French whore was always flirting with your father, always giving in to his advances, always." I was immediately stunned by the mention of my dad, and she could see the expression on my face change. Her tone became more frantic, more defensive. I was 16 and pregnant, and he was going to leave me for her, that little slut. So I pushed her down the stairs. She shut her eyes, probably unable to stand the judgment and the shock in my gaze. I pushed her down the stairs. Then I buried her with Daddy's cement out back. It was like she was reverting back to that little girl as she spoke. She opened her eyes, which were red from the strain and crying, and shouted in my face. "I killed her, and now she's going to kill me. You can't leave, Dietrich. You can't let her kill me." I was shocked. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, and she just kept shaking me, rocking me back and forth as she tugged on my shirt. I whispered for her to stop, then I said it outright, then I shouted it, and shoved her when she didn't let go. Her grip on my shirt slipped, and she stumbled backward, stepping onto the exposed nail at the top of the staircase. She shrieked in pain and tumbled backward, the nail tearing through her foot as she collapsed down the flight of stairs. I was frozen in shock, watching as she hit every stair on her way to the bottom. I had to catch my breath before I followed her down, slowly ascending every step, careful not to step on the smeared blood, and shifting all of my weight on the banister, feeling like I might collapse myself. Mom was laying on the floor at the foot of the staircase, a twisted mess of a person. A hole was torn from the center of her foot outward through her toes. Her neck was crooked, bone jutting out where it bent at an impossible angle. Her right arm was beneath her body, her left one bent backward, and her legs folded. She lay there still, looking like a discarded doll, and if not for her wheezing could have well played the part. "Please," she whined, staring up at me through the tears and blood in her eyes. "Dietrich, please. Dietrich, please." I clutched my mouth. I was staring at my mother, broken in a way no boy should ever have to see a parent. I was also looking at a murderer, a killer who had just confessed to ending an innocent life out of jealousy. Not just any life, either. My Calliope, who had once lived, only to be robbed from life too early by the woman on the floor in front of me. Dieter, itch, pee please. I looked back and saw Calliope. She was sitting at the top of the staircase, her head leaning against the banister. I looked at her amber eyes, and for once swore I could see something in them, real emotion. Delight. One look in her eyes and I knew what I had to do. I looked back down at the crippled creature on the floor below me. All pity and fear had left me, and I raised my leg and broke my boot down on her jaw. I dragged my mom's body out the door and stuffed it into the trunk of her Cadillac and let it drift on neutral into a local river. As I watched it sink beneath the inky murk, I remember looking up at the sky, finding it remarkable just how yellow the moon was that night. When I got home, the blood trail leading down the staircase and out the door was completely gone. As I walked up the stairs, I noticed that even the nail jutting out of the top step was missing. The door to my room was open, and there lay Calliope, waiting for me. I held her to my chest and slept dreamlessly through the night. The next day I told the cops what my mom told me. I said she confessed to the murder of a girl about 19 years ago, just before running off with some guy she met at a bar in town. They had their questions, of course, but the forensics on the body dug up in my backyard showed that I would have to be a really murderous baby if I was responsible. Mom apparently made a reputation for herself as a drunk while I was away, and with no signs of struggle the cops had no trouble believing my story. All of that was back in October. I sold the house to a family friend who reached out not long after Mom went missing, and I hear from him every now and then. Calliope and I are living in a one-bedroom apartment in Beteron now. I think she likes the beach. I'm hoping we can move to France someday. Somewhere with a beach. I don't regret what I did. Even if I wish my mother was still the person she was before we moved into that house, I know that all of that was a lie. She was a killer the whole time. Anyone who had robbed the world of an angel like Calliope deserved what they had coming. I'm making this post because I recently got a call from the guy who bought that old house. He usually calls me every other week, sometimes to check in, ask if I heard from my mom, who is technically wanted for murder, so why would I tell him if I did? And sometimes to ask mundane questions about the house. This time was different, though. After his usual small talk, he asked me about the doll I left among my mom's stuff, you know, the one that kind of looks like her. Except for the yellow eyes, I'm leaving now, before Mom's doll can get me like Calliope got her. I'm never setting foot in that house again, and I hope when I'm gone this post can maybe clear things up a bit. I'm not scared, though. Cautious, sure, but I have Calliope here to protect me. We're together now, and nothing is going to tear us apart. As I'm writing this, though, I keep glancing out my window. I can't help but feel anxious about how unseasonably yellow the moon is tonight. Story 3. My dad disappeared 11 years ago. I think I know why. My dad was, and still is, my hero. I'm sure it sounds like just another worn-out glitch, And hell, it might be, but it is very important to me that you remember this piece of information because otherwise, all the things that I am going to tell you about, all the actions I've taken, will make me seem like a total lunatic. He was an anthropologist by trade, and you could tell from the moment you met him. Even as young as I was, I knew that my dad loved people. He was fascinated by them, and he adored everything about them. It was woven into the dorky Hawaiian dad shirts he wore when he threw spontaneous backyard barbecues, tucked into his palm as he enthusiastically shook hands with every barista and bank teller he met, and etched into the crinkles of his eyes as he let out another boisterous laugh, the sort of laugh that made everyone else in the area want to laugh with him. People, it seems, loved him too. He wrote a lot of books, and apparently his personality shone even in writing because they sold incredibly well. It was after the smashing success of one book in particular, one discussing folk legends in our home state of Colorado, that he decided we would buy the vacation home. God, it seems bitterly ironic looking back on it now. But we'll get to that. The vacation home was in a tiny Welsh town called Arforder. It was, as the Welsh name suggests, on the sea, and the town lined a semicircular divot in the country's coastline, flanked on either side by craggy cliffs. Only a short distance out from the beach, approximately where the center of the circle would be if it were completed, there was a tiny island. It was scarcely more than a large rock, harboring little besides a couple of small grottos and a smattering of gulls' nests. It was called Morgan's Isle. I only ever got to spend a couple of summers at the house, but I remember those summers very fondly. My dad was deeply interested in the area, not only because of his appreciation for Welsh culture, or what little remained after the gentrification of the area, but also because of some of the town's more unique attractions. Two in particular stand out to me as I reflect on it, and both involved the island. If you were outside at night, or when a dense fog had blanketed the town, you could hear a low, haunting melody rolling in off the sea. It was like someone playing the flute, resonant and mournful, far away across the water. My dad thought that it was the wind, catching in the cracks and crevices of Morgan's Isle and flowing back out across the water, friction from the sea-soaked rocks producing the ghostly howl. During the day, he said, the sounds of the town drowned it out. But at night, we would sit together on the back porch of the house and listen to the island sing across the inky sea. From our porch, it was also possible to observe the other phenomenon. If you looked out towards the island on a clear night, it was possible to see small, glittering points of light drifting over the dark water. They typically appeared in pairs, and they seemed to dip and swell as if riding atop the waves. My dad thought that it was a trick of the moonlight, perhaps an unusual reflection from something on the island or the shore. And he thought they were beautiful. Like diamonds drifting on the sea, he said. And I looked up at him, stars in my eyes, and agreed. I was only 9 when he disappeared. He had decided that he was going to go out fishing for the day. We had a small boat, and he went out on it pretty frequently, leaving in the mid-morning and not returning until the last dregs of sunlight were slipping from the sky. Usually, he would let me come with, and I begged to go that day too, but he wouldn't let me. I'm still not sure why. Maybe I had been particularly clingy for the days preceding, or maybe he was planning to go out and do something dangerous that morning. I don't know. But I do know that, as darkness fell that evening, he didn't come back. And he never did again. They found the boat, bashed up against the cliffs a few miles down the coast from Arforder, but no sign of Dad. While accidents like this were uncommon in the area, they were not unheard of, and it was ultimately written off as an accidental drowning. They trawled the area for a while, looking for his body, but nothing turned up, and after the worst plane ride of our lives, my mom and I had to bury an empty casket. We didn't go back to the vacation home after that. We were all right financially, as my dad had left us a sizable chunk of savings to supplement my mom's income, but we couldn't face going back to where it had all happened. At the same time, though, my mom couldn't bear to get rid of the place. And so it sat, falling into disrepair, for 11 years. Until a few days ago. I recently turned 20, and after having something of an early life crisis, decided it was time to get some closure. My mom was not a big fan of my decision. If it was up to her, we would just let the house rot to nothing and never think about it again. But I had made up my mind, and before she could mount any real effort to stop me, I was bound for Cardiff Airport. I opted to check into Arfordeer's small inns rather than attempting to stay in the house. This turned out to be a smart decision, as, when I arrived at our old vacation home, it was in a state of severe disrepair. Being so close to the sea, weathering had taken its toll on the home's exterior, and the once well-kept garden had turned into a tangle of unkempt grass and thorny weeds. The interior was largely preserved, save for one room which had flooded through a hole in the roof, but a thick layer of dust had settled over what little furnishings had remained when we'd vacated the place. Evening was fast approaching, and I decided that it would be best if I returned to the inn to decide what to do with the place. As I was pushing through the door, I turned back one last time, half expecting to see my dad sitting on the stairs behind me. But no one was there. After a restless night, I decided to spend the next day, yesterday, out on the water. I bought some supplies from a dingy little tackle shop and slid into a rented boat in the harbor. As I chugged out into the sea, I had this eerie feeling that I was reliving my dad's last day. Peering across the glittering waves, my eyes snagged on a narrow cave tucked into the jagged flank of Morgan's Isle. I started steering towards it for a moment, but stopped myself. What was I doing? I'd seen people try to approach the cave before, and a patrol boat would always stop you, saying that it wasn't safe for public access. Liable to collapse, they'd say. A tiny part of my brain whispered that they probably hadn't checked there, all those years ago. They would have thought that it was too dangerous, not worth the risk of searching. Maybe, just maybe. No, I shook my head as if to knock the idiotic thoughts out of my brain. I was there to get closure, not to open some silly, dangerous, and likely fruitless investigation. I found myself a good spot a little ways past the island instead, and settled in for a day of fishing. I didn't end up catching anything. We had never caught much when I was younger anyway, and the years between had taken their toll on the already dwindling fish population. Besides, I could never quite completely wipe the thoughts of the cave from my mind. Before I knew it, the long, uneasy afternoon had slipped away into evening, and darkness spread quickly across the sky like a stain. As I rounded the island, I could see no other silhouettes against the shimmering lights of the town. I was alone on the water, and I was so close to the cave. I dragged my palms down my face. I knew I wouldn't get a wink of sleep if I didn't at least check, and besides, now was the perfect opportunity, with no patrol boats crawling around. Hidden by the darkness of the open sea, I anchored the boat as close as I could to the tiny, rocky beach at the cave's mouth, and splashed my way to the entrance, wincing as the icy water soaked into my sneakers. Standing on the gravel beach, I fumbled in my pocket. I was relieved to feel the clink of my key ring against my fingertips. Pulling it out, I pressed the button on the small flashlight that I kept clipped to the ring, and its weak beam cut through the darkness ahead of me. The small comfort that the light afforded me was dashed as I heard scuffling from behind some large stones just a few feet ahead. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight toward the source of the sound, and I stumbled back as a figure moved from behind the rocks. "Dad?" It had come out as a question, but as my disbelieving eyes flickered over the man in front of me, I was sure it was him. He was much older and far scruffier than he was when I'd last seen him, and he was still somewhat obscured by the shadows of the cave entrance. Still, I felt certain. It was my dad. My heart leapt in elation, and I stumbled forward, slipping on the loose, wet gravel in my haste to embrace him. To my dismay, however, he started backwards, jerking out of the way of my open arms and slipping backwards, further into the cave. "There's no time, Carter." His voice was rough and strangled with disuse. "What?" He jerked his head backwards, indicating for me to follow him into the cave. I was so stunned by the strangeness of the interaction, by his sudden appearance, and by his form retreating further into the darkness of the cave, that I followed without question. At that moment, it seemed like the only thing I could do. While his strides seemed quick and practiced, mine were rendered unsteady by the slick rock beneath me. He was still just ahead of me, just on the edge of my flashlight beam, but I had to pick up my halted, slippery pace to keep up with him as he continued to press on. "There's no time for reunions yet. I promise you, all of that will come in due time, but for now I just need you to trust me." I was out of breath from our rapid pace, and though questions burned at the tip of my tongue, I wasn't able to vocalize them. The walls of the cave seemed slightly closer now, and my claustrophobia built into a lump in my throat, further blocking any attempt at communication I might make. Years ago, the day I disappeared, I discovered a ritual site in the back of this cave, he explained, as I staggered onward. I don't remember what happened between then and 2 days ago. All I know is that I woke up here, with the ritual site glowing around me. I managed to find out the date from a passing boat. I don't know what happened, Carter, and I'm so sorry for leaving you for so long, but I do know that something is happening tonight in this cave. I don't know what will happen if we don't stop it, but I don't want to find out. And I need your help. My head was spinning with all the new information. He was still moving quickly in front of me, and stunned as I was, I lost my focus for a moment, and, with it, my footing. My toe caught a small ledge on the ground beneath me, and I tripped, halting for a moment as I caught myself on my hands, scraping myself badly. However, it was not the pain that I noticed. The moment I had stopped, so had my dad. I stood slowly and took another step forward. So did he. I took a few more, and he followed. But each time I stopped, he would too. It was as though he was determined to stay exactly as far from me as he was currently. Just close enough to still be visible, just far enough to avoid the full power of my feeble flashlight beam. My blood ran cold. "Carter, come on," he said gruffly, urgency, and something else that I know now to have been hunger, distorting his tone. "We have to hurry." That had been the point all along, hadn't it? To hurry me along, feed me lots of information all at once, give me no time to think. But now I was thinking. It was a plausible story, sure. My dad had been a curious man, and if he had seen the same opportunity I had, it was certainly possible that he would have tried to explore the cave as well. An anthropologist would have been intrigued by a perceived ritual site, and if something supernatural had indeed happened, it could explain his disappearance in the manner that he described. But something still bugged me. As I mentioned, my dad had always loved people. Now, the first person he's seen in 11 years, even if those 11 years were a timeless blur, arrives at the cave, and he spends no time greeting them. Not even when that person is his own son. It didn't seem right. I tensed my hand around my keychain and, in one smooth motion, moved forward and focused the pale beam right on the figure in front of me. He jolted backward as quickly as he could, but it wasn't fast enough. Not this time. And I finally saw him for what he was. Sure, he looked a lot like my dad. An aged-up, banged-up version of him, tailor-made to look as if he'd been unconscious in a cave for 11 years. An excellent copy. but I could also see why he'd been avoiding the light. In the detail afforded by the dim light, I could see the way his limbs seemed slightly too long, the way his shoulders didn't quite slot in their sockets, the way his teeth seemed just a bit too large for his mouth. And his eyes. Christ. They were the same color as my dad's, sure, but that is where the resemblance ended. They were empty, glassy, artificial, like the false eyes they stick in taxidermied animals. A poor imitation of the real thing. My dad was an anthropologist, and I know a person when I see one. This wasn't. The next few minutes are a blur in my memory. I remember sprinting back in the direction I'd come, slipping and sliding on the algae-coated stone beneath me. I could hear him chasing me. And worse, I could hear more of them behind him, scampering through the cave on what sounded to me like wet, slippery, clawed hands and feet. As I ran, I kicked rocks backwards, hoping they would slow the creature's progress. I guess it must have worked, because the next thing I knew, I had flung myself into my boat and gunned it away from the island, not even bothering to look back and see how close an escape it had been. This brings me to today. As you might expect, I didn't sleep a wink. I spent the whole night researching, trying to figure out exactly what it was that happened to me. From what I've put together, it is likely that the first part of the story I was told was true. My dad probably did see the cave, seek the opportunity to explore it under the cover of darkness, and venture deep into it, hoping to discover a hidden anthropological treasure. But I don't think he found anything human in that horrible place, and I am certain now, even more than I was, that he is dead. Do you know where the name Morgan's Isle comes from? I certainly didn't before my midnight research session. I had always assumed that it was just named after an important figure in the area, like Jacksonville or Pennsylvania in the US. It turns out, though, that this is not the case. I doubt that many of the current residents of Arforder would pick up on the name's significance. Hardly any of them are Welsh, and fewer still are old enough or rooted enough in the area to remember any of the legends attached to it. As it turns out, a Morgan or Morgan is a Welsh term for a creature that entices men into its lair, usually with its beauty or enchanting voice, in order to drown or consume them. In the US, we might refer to this creature as a siren. I believe that it is likely these creatures that I encountered in the cave last night, and if this is the case, there is no doubt in my mind that they are responsible for the disappearances of a number of visitors and locals alike over the years, including my poor father. As I am typing this, I am sitting on the back porch of the old vacation home. My flight leaves tomorrow morning, and I have one more night in the grubby little inn up the road, but something called me back here, telling me to look out over the darkened sea one last time. I sincerely hope that it wasn't the sound that brought me here, that beautiful, achingly sorrowful timbre that echoes up the bluffs and draws me closer, sounding so much more melodic than it did all those years ago. Leaning in, I can see the flecks of light on the water again, tipping hypnotically up and down as waves roll by beneath them. I feel sick to my stomach. My dad was wrong. They aren't anything like diamonds. Looking at them now, I can see them for what they are. Fake. Dead. Empty. Like taxidermy. Story 4. I explored an abandoned wing of hell. Whoever had carved the door relished in the anatomy of suffering. It was a 2-story tall slab of copper, set directly into a cavern wall. Its surface carved with a vast and complex bas-relief that worried the eye. A cloying, confusing mix of human bodies sprawling upwards in a mound of naked flesh, many glancing horrified over their shoulders while fleeing something out of frame and out of sight. Thousands of them. starved and wretched with gaunt faces and sunken eyes, jutting ribs and distended bellies. There were rumors that they moved, but only when you weren't looking. Less than a week after its discovery, they brought it down with explosives. We didn't really know what we'd found at that point, although I'm sure a few of us, particularly the religious, had their suspicions. The door was wrong. All wrong. It just shouldn't have been there. Natural caverns don't go that deep in Britain. Not 1,000 meters. As scientists, we should have been excited, but we all agreed the door was repulsive. Staring at it too long induced a powerful urge to flee. An ancestral memory, maybe. The same way our bodies know to avoid things that crawl and slither. Things that rot and buzz and stink of death and decay. They never told us how or why they found it, nor why the project was classified. Only that we had to figure out what was on the other side. When the charges finally blew, they went off like giant firecrackers. A string of them that ran around the gateway. One by one. Deafening booms that shook the entire cavern. I was left blinking dust out of my eyes as great machines lowered the door, now free of its couplings, to the ground. Looking back, some details come easier than others. The air that wafted out was hot and dry, and I was not surprised. That seemed intuitively correct. Whether I'd admitted it to myself or not, the fact was I'd been thinking of the door as a gateway to hell pretty much since I'd first laid eyes on it. And my mental image of hell was oddly medieval. I expected great big stone walls, something reminiscent of an ancient castle. Rattling chains. The wailing of the damned. The stench of sulfur. God, even little red devils with horns and pointy tails. But I hadn't expected shelves and books. That was the first real thing we saw. Shelves lining the walls that had been dug directly into the same rock as the cavern. Shelves that rose far above our lights, so that when we looked up there was only darkness and dust, but no limits to the endless row and row of shelving. Every last inch covered in books. There were no gaps. Just dust and tattered spines of random sizes. Leather. Fabric. Paperback. Faded pastels and gold leaf letters and alphabets both familiar and strange. And it wasn't just the walls. The floor was littered with random head-high piles of books, all stacked up, like some tired librarian had gotten fed up of finding room for them. They made a labyrinth of the place, obscuring corners and doors. And the forward team, myself included, progressed carefully along the stone passageway, listening and looking carefully for some signs that would make sense of the place. There must have been thousands of books, and that was just in the first hallway we explored. Whenever we took one out, we found paper so thin it was nearly translucent, and often inked with strange shapes and letters I couldn't recognize. Otherwise, it was gibberish. Not that we studied them too long on that first day. Whenever I took one, I returned it quickly. Lifting them up, I always had the strangest sensation that I was doing something wrong. Inappropriate. And I didn't like the space they left behind on the shelves. A gap like a missing tooth, the darkness within swirling like deep waters. Safety in that place felt like an illusion, and touching the books was at risk of shattering it. I don't know how else to put it, except I didn't want to do anything that might draw attention to me. It was as if we were extremely conspicuous. There were no sounds but those we made. Our own breath. Our own footfalls. The shuffle and scuffle of our every movement. We could even hear each other's heartbeats. The discordant bump of several people's chests beating, like a broken drum set. And every now and again, a racing. A steady increase in the beat's cadence as we turned a blind corner, or lifted a book just to see what it contained, or looked up at the shadows above us. Each of us kept having false starts, because there was always this expectation that you were going to see something. Soon. Any second now. squeezed between two books or dangling overhead. It took 6 more hours before that corridor opened up, and when it did, we were dumbfounded. We emerged onto a vast and terrifying mezzanine made of ancient rock, overlooking a chasm with no visible bottom. Just floor after floor filled with shelves filled with books. Millions, billions. And all along those distant walls and stories were little openings that led to more corridors like the one we just emerged from. So many that it was like staring at a roughshod beehive. To look up or down or anywhere was to be faced with more books than anyone could read in their entire lifetime. We took our first break on that mezzanine. While radios didn't go very far in that place, we'd had the sense to carry enough wire to allow for a hard connection, and using that we contacted the main research site and updated them on the situation. We were to keep going for another 6 hours and turn around. A day, no more, was the plan. Even that felt like too long. I wanted to leave. I wanted to confirm that somewhere was a doorway that would lead back to reality, because ever since I'd entered that place, it felt like I'd entered a nightmare. A place where reality was plastic. I told myself it was simply the scale of it all. The weirdness. But it was more than that. The very air down there felt thin. There were 6 of us. 3 scientists and 3 soldiers. The soldiers responded to the situation with silence and an alertness that bordered on paranoia, constantly scanning the dark with their rifle-mounted lights, flicking the beam from one high-up shelf to another, fidgeting, exchanging dark looks. In a way, I was thankful, but it put me on edge too, and I couldn't relax at all for the first half of our little break. I guess it was natural that the scientists got talking. This was partly to fill the quiet, but also partly to try and convince ourselves we were excited about the implications of this find, whatever those may be. Rewriting history. Archaeology on a new level. That kind of thing. It didn't take long before we convinced ourselves to take a closer look at those books. I'll admit it didn't come easy, but we did a pretty good job of convincing ourselves that we weren't really afraid. We started slowly, taking one book down, opening and then quickly replacing it. But then with false bravery, we took more and more came down until each of us were sat cross-legged with several books stacked up on either side, waiting to be read. I remember at some point I must have grown tired and looked up from my own pile because I noticed Dr. Eisling muttering quietly as she traced some words with her fingers. "What have you found?" "It's Latin alphabet," she said. First one I actually recognized the letters for. German, maybe. None of us were linguists, so we were simply doing our best. But upon hearing B mention German, one of the soldiers came over and looked at the open page. "Germanic, but not German," he said. "You speak it?" He nodded. "My father is German, and I don't know what that is, but it isn't German. Is any of it familiar?" B asked while handing the book to him. After a brief nod from his Lady Meikle, he took it and began flicking through the pages. "I think this is the word for death. A sort of rough misspelling, maybe. This one is. I guess it's a bit like wanting. Desiring? I don't know. Not all of the words seem like they're in the right context either, so they're in a variety of languages and alphabets, but as of yet nothing we can make sense of. What about you? Any luck?" B asked me, and I looked down at the book currently open in my hands. Some kind of Cyrillic, maybe? I shrugged. I'm no linguist. We definitely need Dr. Sellers on the next expedition. I'm sure he could offer some insight. What about you, Dr. Rosenstein? The third scientist in our group, a little bald man, had been sitting quietly the entire time we spoke, frowning at one of several books that lay open before him. I assumed he was just curious, like B and I. "Grant," I said, trying to get his attention. Hey, Grant, have you found anything? His silence unnerved me. He wasn't just captivated. Sweat was prickling his forehead, and veins bulged along his temple. He had gone pale, and his eyes were wide and his lips cracked and dry. The soldiers, picking up on the same strange signals I had, stood a little more upright. Dr. Rosenstein? One of them asked nervously. Doctor, can you hear us? The nearest soldier reached out and placed a hand on Grant's shoulder, and the little man looked up at us like he hadn't even realized we existed until that moment. At first, I thought he was relieved, the way he stared at each of us with a dumb grin on his face. But I soon realized something wasn't quite right. Oh, he said with an anxious laugh. Oh, right. Of course, his eyes darted between us. Of course. Sorry. I didn't mean to alarm you. Right, I said. Well, we were just talking about the books. B thinks hers might be in a kind of German or Germanic language. He nodded like this made perfect sense. Yes, I imagine so, he replied while looking around the shelves that towered over us. Lots of languages, I'd say, and then, without really missing a beat, he added, their sins. The group fell into silence as each of us tried to make sense of what he'd just said. In the meantime, he stood up and stretched, like it was the most natural thing in the world. What are you on about? I said once it became clear he wasn't going to elaborate. It's fairly obvious where we are, he said while leaning forward and eyeing us darkly. And these books are a list of all our sins. One for each of us. So there will be books in German, both contemporary and historic German, like the one you found Dr. Iseling. But there will also be books in Russian and French and Arabic and Chinese. Not just contemporary tongues either. Ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, Babylonian, Aramaic, Latin, and of course, lost languages. Ones that we never found but existed anyway. All of them. All the transgressions of the world are right here, recorded in the sinner's original tongue. By now, the soldiers had stepped a little closer, and B and I were sharing deeply worried looks. Grant seemed to be in the middle of a breakdown, speaking frantically and anxiously, convinced of his own meaning while not really saying anything of sense. Grant, I think we need to go ba. The real fun is that I think you'll find books in languages that don't exist yet, he blurted. This isn't just a record of sins in the past, but all of them. Every last one. Even the ones we haven't committed yet. Grant, I'm going to have one of the men go back with you. If that's okay? I think you might not. These are mine, he said while gesturing to the book in his hand. All of them. He laughed. Not just the things I did. Petty transgressions all recorded with names and places and even little diagrams. But there are even sins I only ever thought. Things I wanted to do. And, he added while giggling hysterically, sins I've yet to commit. He flicked through the pages at random and giggled manically at something only he could see. Although there aren't many. He cackled as he turned to the final page, tears welling in his eyes. Just one, actually. The last one. The last sin I'll ever commit. Grant, I said, I think you, before any of us could react. He dropped the book and took a running leap over the nearest ledge. This is the way we came, right? B stood at the threshold of a corridor, her light tracking a wire that snaked into the darkness. That's the cable we carried in here with us, one of the soldiers said. But the young man looked over to his Lady Meikle, who had a compass in hand and didn't look happy. It's not the direction we came, the older man said. We came south, so we need to head north. That would be this doorway. He nodded at a second corridor embedded in the rock wall. This has to be the way, B said. I trust this cable a hell of a lot more than I do a compass. Anything could be interfering with that thing. Besides, we know the cable leads to HQ because it's still working. We spoke to them only a few minutes ago via this wire. It has to lead out of here. That makes sense, I added, but I marked the way we left with a piece of chalk. And that mark is over here. I pointed to a third doorway. Fuck, Mikkel muttered. Regardless, I vote wire, B said. I trust it the most. It's a physical connection. I guess I vote wire too, Mikkel added. Me too. But what do we do if we're wrong? I asked. What does that even mean? Did something move the wire? Or the door? We all went silent for a few moments as we contemplated this. When nobody offered up an answer, I eventually grabbed my backpack and hauled it up. I guess we don't have much of a choice either way, I said. Do you think there's really a book in here for everyone? B asked, and it was the first any of us had spoken in a few hours. So far, we had all been walking, fixated on the gloom ahead and behind us, watching carefully for some sign that our fevered imaginations were right to suspect something lurking in the dark. Grant seemed to think so, I said. Then what are the odds he picked his own book out? I mean, if he's right, there are, what, 100 billion books or so. More, I replied. If he's right about the library containing future sins as well as past, pretty slim odds then, she added. What are you thinking? If he did find it here, I don't think it was a coincidence, she said. Up ahead, one of the soldiers came to a sudden stop. Fist raised, he muttered something to the others who knelt and lifted their rifles, aiming at the dark. What is it? I asked. Don't you hear it? Mikkel called back. All of us stopped and listened carefully, straining to pick out some meaningful sound from the white noise of blood rushing through our ears and the thumping of our own hearts. Sure enough, it was there. A gentle rustling. Without speaking, all of us moved as quietly as we could along the corridor until we came to the source of the strange noise. A door, one that hadn't been there on our way and left, ever so slightly ajar. Rifle raised, one of the soldiers used his barrel to nudge it open a little farther. Oh shit, he said, his voice loud enough to send echoes down the hall. The sound came as a shock and Mikkel pulled him back, ready to admonish, when we all saw what had been waiting on the other side. Another corridor, only this one had shelves lined not with books, but severed heads. Desiccated, pale, and gaunt. Row after row. All sitting neatly next to one another, evenly spaced. Their skin paper white in the harsh glare of our lights. And all of them with cloudy eyes. And they were speaking. Sotto voce. Little whispers. They muttered in a discord of wet lips. No breath. No lungs. Only the action of rubbery jaws to sound out syllables and consonants that were lost in the rustling cacophony. The sound was horrific. Wet and dry and deeply unsettling. It worked its way under my skin until I felt the strangest urge to lash out at the heads. But curiosity overrode disgust, and I approached one, wincing briefly when it fixed me with its cloudy eyes, but I didn't stop. I got close enough to see every detail of its flaking skin, its rheumy eyes glaring at me with such strange emotion. For my own sanity, I reached out and picked it up, noting with disgust how the stump of its neck left mottled brown fluid on the shelf behind. I guess I just wanted to know if it was fake, but its skin was cold and its brow furrowed with anger at my touch. And as soon as it was in the air, every other head stopped their muttering and fixed me with such foul expressions, I quickly put it back down again, relieved when the murmuring resumed. Still, its eyes did not leave me. What the fuck? B whispered. What is this? Mikkel asked as he scanned the upper shelves with his torch. On and they went, as far as we could see. What the actual fuck is this? Slowly, a strange thought began to form in my mind. Blink if you can understand me, I said while kneeling down to look at the head I'd picked up. Everyone else in the group suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned to see the result of my little experiment. Blink. Okay, 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 I repeated while trying to calm myself down. Right. Once for no, twice for yes. Do you understand? Blink. Blink. Right. Okay. I looked to the others for suggestions when B piped up instead. Are these books a list of all our sins? Blink. Blink. One book for one person? Blink. Blink. So what are you? She asked, and this elicited a scathing look from the severed head. Yes or no questions, I told her. One of the soldiers, the youngest one, the one who'd helped translate the German, stepped up and spoke. Is this hell? He asked. Blink. Blink. Is this your punishment? He added. Blink. If this isn't the punishment, he said, what is? All the heads stopped their muttering and began to emit the strangest noise, their faces twisting upwards and warping into grotesque parodies of joy, while their mouths moved up and down in a peculiar sort of rhythm. When I realized what they were doing, I felt a terrible sensation of cold dread creeping down my entire body. They were laughing at us. There was no door. The wire slipped through a tiny hole at the base of a wall that blocked off the corridor. All of us were stunned into silence for minutes until at last, Lady Meikle shook himself free from the shock and issued an order. Davies, get HQ on the line. One of the soldiers knelt down and began to remove the communication set from his backpack. Within a few seconds, it was set up, and he was speaking into the handset. HQ, can you read me? Over. I can read you. Well, I guess the wire still leads to HQ, I said. Try checking the wall for seams, Meikle told me. See if it moves. Hidden hinges? Or something. I don't know. Then turning back to the soldier with the handset, tell them we've encountered an obstacle and we want them to send another team in to get us. Oh, and tell them to bring explosives. If this thing opens, I said while running my hand along the edges, I can't see how. It's pretty solid, and like every other wall we'd seen so far, this one was made of red bricks, but that didn't mean it was somehow mobile either. It seemed as sturdy as any brick wall I'd come across. Well, it came from somewhere. B cried while trying to peer through the hole the wire disappeared through. Damn it, I can't see anything, HQ, the soldier said. We're gonna need some assistance. There is an obstacle. Over, roger that. What's the obstacle? A wall, he replied. Tell the next team to bring explosives. Over, a wall. Just send the team ASAP, the soldier cried. Our way out is blocked. Over, well, I can confirm we are en route to your position. Just one question, HQ replied. What's that? Over, the young man replied. Why do you keep saying over? Suddenly, the voice changed. It began to titter and giggle, at first quietly, but then louder and louder, like a mean kid laughing at a prank. The cruelty in its high-pitched voice made my skin crawl, and I was about to snatch the handset myself and begin demanding answers when there was the strangest sound. A heavy grinding, like stone turning against stone. Before I could even ask what it was, Bee fell backwards from where she crouched and quickly leaped up into a standing position and ran off into the dark like a maniac. The effect on the group was chilling, and I stared back at the wall, desperately trying to understand what I'd seen. Williams, go get her. He barked at one of the soldiers before turning to me and crying, What the fuck is her problem? I don't know, I stammered. Christ, Meikle hissed before snatching the handset off the confused young soldier. Listen, he growled into it. I don't know who you really are, but you need to get someone in charge right. That sound again, loud and heavy, the grinding of heavy rocks being moved, and tiny stones came raining down in a cloud of dust. Something up there had disturbed them, and we all stood in silence as they plinked off our helmets. "Is it just me?" Mikkel said while looking towards the wall. "Or is it somehow closer?" "Hard to say," I replied. "I don't." The wall moved. A sudden and terrifying lurch forwards, one that startled us all and made me trip over my own feet. Terrified, I scrambled backwards from it as fast as I could, while the handset continued to radiate that malicious laughter. "I think we need to go," I said in as calm a voice as I could manage. The wall moved again, and this time it did not stop. The young soldier with the handset did not react fast enough. It came forward so quickly that it had him within seconds and knocked him to the floor with a heavy thump. And then it rolled over him, and it was. Well, if you're anything like me, as a child you might have wondered what happened to someone who got caught in an escalator. At the very top. I'm sure you know what I mean. Light was poor, so I still don't really understand what happened. Only that there was a lot of blood, and while it was quick, it was not quick enough because when the wall was about halfway up his spine, I could still see the pain registering in his eyes. And that was the last impression I had before Mikkel grabbed me by the collar and practically threw me back the way we came. And then we ran. Running. Plodding. One foot after another. I don't know how long it went on for, but it was as if time seemed to stretch on in the way that only pain and tedium can induce. There were moments where, as I struggled to force one foot in front of the other, I wondered if I'd actually been running for days, not hours. There was no real way to mark the passage of time. Only monotony. Books went by in a blur. The floor was featureless stone. The rhythmic sound of my feet lost all meaning. And behind me, the wall, ever advancing with the horrible sound of grinding rocks, promising pain and nothing else. The only thing I could actually focus on was the exhaustion, and that was self-defeating. More than a few times, I wondered if I should just give up. And to this day, I still have nightmares where I am being chased down that corridor. It wasn't a quick pace, but it was quick enough, and there were no other routes except forward, and therein lay the torture of it. Behind me was death moving at a brisk jog, and ahead of me was nothing. Just darkness broken by the erratic motion of a torch. And the entire time, which I would later realize was a good 2 hours, the only thing I could think was, when am I going to lose this fight? When am I going to collapse? Or give up? Imagine my relief when, up ahead, I heard a familiar voice cry out, "What is your problem, lady?" And then I saw them. The young man held Bee by her shoulders while she tried to drag him through an open door. That was when I remembered the little corridor with the severed heads. Not exactly the kind of salvation I was hoping for, but it'd have to do. Together, Mikkel and I grabbed both of them and threw us all through the opening. Seconds later, far too close for comfort, the entire corridor we'd been running through went pitch black. The wall overtook our positions, and we were left panting and exhausted on the floor where thousands of severed heads looked at us in annoyance. When we looked back the way we came, we saw that nothing but pulsating flesh. A wall of it. Hot and sticky and threaded with sickly blue veins. I don't know what that wall was, but something about the meat behind the stone made me think of hungry coral. It was a fucking trap, Mikkel hissed as he inspected the horrible mass. I don't know how, but we were led down the wrong path. It swapped the cables. Or something. I don't know. But we were lured down there like rats. "Where's Davies?" the other soldier asked. "He's gone," Mikkel said. "What?" The older man gestured to the wall of meat behind us. "Whatever the fuck the thing has got him." It looked like a wall, but it It could move, and it just steamrolled him. "Thanks for the warning, by the way," he growled at Bee, but she showed no sign of understanding him. Instead, she was sat on the floor and shaking, clearly in a state of shock. "Where now, sir?" the remaining soldier asked, and Mikkel grimaced. "Where do you think?" He spat before gesturing at the route forward. "The only direction that's available. The heads made for strange companions." They followed us with their eyes, but did not stop their muttering. It was grating, to say the least. A noise you could ignore for maybe an hour or so, but pretty soon, the papery rustle of their ancient lips was the only thing you could focus on, no matter how hard you tried to push it out of your head. At least navigation was simple. Forward. Only the one way to go. We walked for about 6 hours before we took our first break. The corridor was wide, but we stayed away from the heads and slept in a row, head to feet, while 2 of us stayed on watch. 6 hours each. I decided to stay up along with Mikkel as Bee and the other soldier tried to rest. Bee had barely come out of shock during the journey, speaking a little towards the very end. She told us, in a broken way, what she'd seen while kneeling by the wall. Teeth, she said, and a face, although she wouldn't or couldn't elaborate on those 2 statements. I was left with the sense that she had seen something that had come damn close to leaving her completely insane. Even as it was, I doubted she had a full recovery in her. She almost looked like a different woman. Baggy-eyed. Thinning hair. Or maybe it was just the conditions down there. Mikkel didn't look great either, and I had to assume I looked pretty rough too. Especially after that run. It had exhausted me. Broken me. Not just the physical exertion, but the nightmare of it. The reason I'd elected to stay on watch first was because I didn't want to sleep. A part of me was worried I'd just dream about being back in that hallway, running from the moving wall, and I didn't want to revisit that place ever again. Not even as a dream. There were moments where I came so close to just giving up. I don't think I'd ever really experienced despair like that before. Not the kind where you feel your knees buckling and your neck turn to rubber as your head bows. It must be what people stranded at sea feel when they lose the strength to keep treading water. So instead, I stayed up and tried to ignore the muttering of the heads. Even tried talking to Mikkel, but he didn't have much to say. I could tell losing Davies back in the corridor had bothered him. Hell, it bothered me, and I hadn't even known the guy. But I swear to this day, I can still see the look on his face as rock met flesh and his legs and hips just disappeared. In the end, I had only these kinds of thoughts for company. And lots of time. So it probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that I eventually fell asleep. It wasn't for long. 10 minutes at most. But it was enough time for me to wake up and see something drag the sleeping soldier's body into the darkness of the nearest shelf, his neck lolling unnaturally to one side. The movement was gentle, quiet, but clumsy too, like a child pulling a rag doll stealthily out of a toy box. I looked over to Mikkel and saw he'd fallen asleep as well, so I nudged him with my foot, and he woke up with a sort of lazy start. Only when he looked at me, confused for a few short seconds before slowly registering the look of terror on my face, did he seem to realize what was happening. I'm not sure what I expected him to do, really. But he was the leader and well-armed, and I didn't want to be the one who had to figure out what to do next. Possibly because there was a part of me tempted to just sneak off. To leave the young man to his fate. Maybe even be, if it just meant I could survive a little bit longer. In truth, I was relieved when Mikkel leapt into action immediately. I didn't want to be a coward. He jumped up and grabbed the young man's foot, and I ran over and grabbed the other leg, and together we tried to pull him back. I didn't mention it to Mikkel, but the way the soldier's body felt when I grabbed it, the muscles were too relaxed, too heavy. I don't know how to explain it, but if you ever end up in the unfortunate situation of moving a corpse, you might know what I mean. A living body supports itself. A dead one. It's just meat and water, and somehow feels so much heavier for it. He was dead. Still, we fought on. At some point, B must have woken up, realized what was happening, and joined in. I remember her trying to reach into the shelf to grab a hold of the dead man's arm when she suddenly flew backwards, landing with a hefty thud against the shelf behind her and rocking a few of the severed heads on their little stumps. Whatever was in the dark was clearly frustrated. It wanted its next meal, and it wasn't going to let us stop it. Slowly, a long inhuman arm reached out and took a hold of the body's groin. Its strange hand had fingers that split at the knuckle 1, 2, 3 times. A terrifying effect, especially given how each one moved on its own. A dinner plate monster of a hand attached to a lithe and muscular forearm devoid of hair. The second I saw it reach out in my general direction, I let go of the leg and fell backwards. Mikkel continued struggling for a while, even taking out a pistol and firing a few shots into the dark. But in doing so, he left only hand to cling onto his comrade's corpse and lost his grip. With almost no effort, the body disappeared into shadow, and we were suddenly down to 3. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the fuck? He screamed. I wanted to say something. Maybe even something to comfort him. Or maybe an apology for falling asleep. But then again, he'd fallen asleep too. I didn't know what I was meant to do. I was in shock. And it was settling deep into me when B said something from where she remained on the floor. Her voice quiet, but oddly insistent. It isn't over. That hand reemerged. Carefully, deliberately, it placed itself on the floor, revealing more of the pale flesh that powered it. And then came another. And another. And then its head emerged slowly from the dark and fixed me with eyes both black, bulbous, and far too numerous for anything that can be called human. And its mouth, a beard made of dirty fingers, gray and bluish, long rancid nails, hundreds of them squirming like the mandibles of a hungry spider. Mikkel opened fire, but he might as well have been shooting hay for all the effect it had. The bullets struck with a wet thwap, but no actual damage. The creature knocked him aside with pure contempt and pulled the rest of itself out into the corridor, where I saw it had no legs, but instead relied on several long arms to suspend itself between the walls of the corridor, like a kind of spider. One of these arms reached out and grabbed B, and by the time she started screaming, it was already too late. Blood trickled from her ears, and there was a sound like a branch snapping. Her entire body went limp, and the monster dropped her where she fell to the ground, her grotesque misshapen face glaring at me with accusatory eyes. The lieutenant screamed as he fired yet again, but then the thing seized him like he was nothing but a doll and lifted him, squeezing so tightly he dropped everything he held. His gun and torch hitting the ground with a loud rattle. "Help me!" he screamed while reaching out for me to grab him. Jesus Christ! Shoot the fucking thing. I ran forward, crouching down in the hope of avoiding its many arms. Already, Mikkel was being squeezed so tight that blood spurted from his mouth, and I could tell that the monster was having fun, reveling in his torment. I reached out to pick the gun up from the floor as Mikkel let out yet another desperate wet cry for help, but for some reason, my hand stopped mere inches away. I hesitated. Mikkel's blood was dripping down. I could hear the crunching of his ribs. In my most shameful moment, I grabbed the torch and ran. And Mikkel's cries followed me. Screaming, screeching, whimpering. Sounds of breaking bones and tearing paper. Sounds of torture and torment that somehow seemed to last forever. I emerged from the corridor alone. It took me a few seconds of stumbling on my failing legs, to realize that the monster had given up on the pursuit, and then a few seconds more for me to recognize I was back on the mezzanine, terrified and exhausted, and contemplating if it was worth trying to escape, if it meant having to spend another second alive in that place. I fell to the floor and began to sob. Maybe, I thought, it was time to take a dive off that ledge just like Grant had. "What on earth are you doing here?" I whipped around to see an old man in robes staring at me like an impolite intruder. Without meaning to, I began to laugh. My sanity, it was fair to say, was on its final legs. "Hey, Emph," he said while leaning aside to get a look down the long corridor behind. "Now, why did you go down there?" I wanted to answer, but couldn't quite bring myself to do anything except laugh and gasp for air. "I think you really ought to go home," he said like a teacher admonishing a child. "This place is hell," I cried while rocking back and forth on my knees. "Yes," he nodded. "Yes. Good for you. This is a small part of hell, one that has a slight overlap with Earth, if I remember. I'm assuming that's how you got down here." "The door. What happened to your friends anyway?" he added. I looked back the way I came and pointed. "Oh," he sighed. "You know, I left your books out specifically so you'd find them and figure it out. And I know that bald fellow worked it out. So once you knew this place was hell, why did you waste another second sticking around?" I shrugged, not quite sure what I was meant to say to that kind of thing. "We got waylaid," I gasped. "Misled, fair enough," he replied. "Probably should have done more to make sure you got home safely. That's partly my fault, although I won't apologize. You entered this place. Didn't you see the door? What part of that was inviting? You have to take some of the blame. I wanted to mount a defense, but I didn't really have one. When it became clear, the only thing I could do was sob and mutter. The old man's body language softened, and he reached a hand out. "Come on, I'll take you back. What about the demons?" I asked. The old man frowned. "Those weren't demons," he snapped. "This place is defunct. Mortal souls were meant to demonstrate repentance by wandering the near eternal halls in search of their book. Only when they found it were they allowed to move on. Whole thing didn't quite work out. 86 quadrillion books. Takes a tad too long for the average person to find theirs. So this entire wing was abandoned, and now there are only sinners left behind. That thing was never human," I cried while pointing at the corridor I'd emerged from. "Nobody's soul looks human," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Least of all the sort of person who gets sent to hell. This isn't a place for people who eat meat on a Friday or covet their neighbor's ox. It's for the cruel and the malicious. Cowards and opportunists. A lot of people in this place have souls that have more in common with anglerfish and trapdoor spiders than their fellow man. And it's not a condition that gets better after several thousand years either. The soul changes, twists, and so do their physical forms. And what about you?" I said as I reached up and took his hand. "Why do you look so normal?" "Oh," he said as he helped me up. "That's because I built this place. And the last thing I can remember as he gripped me by the shoulder was the sudden and painful sensation of heat. We woke up in our respective quarters. All 6 of us. I still don't fully understand the mechanics. I tried asking the others how they made it back, but they weren't in a state to answer questions. B was catatonic, screaming and clutching her head in the hospital, like she still remembered the way that thing crushed her skull like a grapefruit. The soldier who fell to the wall was left paraplegic, even though medical tests couldn't identify a single reason. Why? Psychological, they said. The other soldier, the one who'd been dragged into the shelves, was comatose. I don't know if he recovered, but he was alive. and Grant was left in a permanent psychotic state, compelled to write on any surface he could over and over again. Sin after sin, desperately trying to rewrite the very book that had driven him to madness in the first place. Mikkel tried very hard to kill me. He had clear memories of being left to die in the dark. I'm glad they caught him before he managed to wring the life out of me with his bare hands. I never found out what happened to him after several men managed to pry his hands from around my throat. Despite everything, I hope he managed some kind of recovery. The door disappeared, thankfully with no one on the other side. I know they were planning future expeditions. It is for the best that kind of thing can't happen again. They have no idea what's waiting for them. In a way, I probably could have convinced myself the expedition never happened. Some days, even now, that's what I sincerely hope can happen. There was no physical evidence. Nothing. We appeared in our beds completely naked save for a note stuck to my chest. And it's this final little touch that stood out to me as stern confirmation of everything I'd experienced. Return to sender, 6 mortals. 5 were damaged in transit. Bodies were repaired to the best of my ability, but I never was any good at that kind of thing. Minds are another matter entirely. Could not help myself in one case. Left fellow mortal to die in the dark. Didn't seem very sporting. Don't let anyone say I lack a sense of humor. Otherwise, no harm, no foul. Best wishes, me. My heart sank when I heard them read it to me. It confirmed my deepest worries. No one had been very honest with me since I'd arrived at the hospital. They'd kept me bandaged up, so it wasn't easy to tell, but after I heard that note, I finally found the courage to reach up and remove the thick wads of fabric. Then with shaking fingers, I finally touched my eyes. Or rather, the empty sockets where they used to be.